Okay, I know I made a video about Help Wanted 2 like a month ago, but oh my god, I had a brain blast. I think we might be wrong about the protagonist of Help Wanted 2, not just the story itself. Slices, put on your aprons and let's bake ourselves a theory. So the big question is, who is the Help Wanted 2 protagonist? Well, we have some theories on it already. Most people, myself included, currently believe that the Help Wanted 2 protagonist is the father of Cassie, the character from Ruin, and for good reason. With the evidence we have, he seems like the most likely option, especially since Help Wanted 2 came out right after Security Breach Ruin. But what is the evidence within Help Wanted 2? How did that lead us to Cassie's dad? Well, the main points are typically as follows. The fact that being the protagonist in general means you likely worked at the Pizzaplex and were looking into what's going on with the Mimic. The fact that Mystic Hippo, when handing you the Faz Wrench, says that the key is familiar to you. The fact that several characters, including Mystic Hippo, Circus Baby, and Moon, all ask, what makes you so special? Being somebody who worked at the Pizzaplex, we have a Vanny mask and a Faz Wrench. The Bonnie mask in Princess Quest is said to be familiar. In one of the endings, our ultimate fate is handing the Vanny mask to Cassie. If the minigames within are based off of our memories, we've worked a lot at the Pizzaplex and we have memories of Fall Fest. Somebody says that the player looks like they have kids, and ultimately, no matter what, they die by the end of this game. That's the majority of evidence that tells us anything about the player of Help Wanted 2. So how does that line up with Cassie's dad? A lot of the information we have from Help Wanted 2 lines up with what we think we know about Cassie's dad, because it's not like we've ever seen him in-game, but we get a lot of information about him from Cassie and the items we collect in Ruin. From that game, we learn that he loves Bonnie, he worked at Fazbear, he knew what happened to Glamrock Bonnie, he has a Faz Wrench, obviously he has a kid, and he's only ever referred to in the past tense. So all of this, plus the fact that Cassie's wearing the same colors as the Bonnie bully, which could then explain the Bonnie mask we see in Princess Quest, means that it all lines up really well, and narratively, it is satisfying. The idea that Cassie basically lives at this Pizzaplex in the daycare because Cassie's dad works there, and then he finds out something nefarious is going on at the Pizzaplex. So for the safety of his own child and his love of the franchise, he begins to look into it and gets deeper down this rabbit hole until eventually it consumes him. And then his folly leads to his biggest regret, the idea that his last vision is giving the mask that ruined his life to his daughter. Narratively, that's a wonderful story, and I still think it's probably the most likely answer. But a train of thought recently came to mind, and I cannot rest until I put it on paper and see how it adds up. Because our second most likely option just reared its ugly head. What if instead of Cassie's dad, Help Wanted 2's protagonist is Edwin Murray? I promise this is a good theory. I promise it's not that bad. Look, I didn't even think Edwin survived the events before Secret of the Mimic before the most recent update, because why would he? The only evidence that we had of Edwin surviving was that we didn't see his body, which isn't evidence he survived, it just isn't proof that he's dead. But then we got the Shadow update, which I made a whole video on 2 weeks ago that you can find right here, but essentially Steelwool updated Secret of the Mimic and added this random shadowy figure wandering around the Digityper office at the beginning and end of the game, and it pretty much has to be a human, and if it's a human, it's either someone we've never met or Edwin Murray, because nobody else frankly makes sense. I got some comments that said that this shadow might be William or Henry, but I don't think that adds up. Fazbear knows how dangerous MCM is. The entire point of Secret of the Mimic is that they're throwing bodies at a problem and hopefully one of them survives to fix it. Which means if Fazbear knows how dangerous MCM is, William and Henry would likely not want to step foot inside until the danger is solved. If William and Henry were willing to enter the facility with the danger present, they would have done so already. They wouldn't need to waste the resources in trying to make it safe. So again, there's no real reason that those two would be here, which I think leads us to assume that this shadow is Edwin Murray, which means he would have survived whatever M2 put him through. So if Edwin Murray was alive, what if he's trying to stop the Mimic again? After all, that's exactly what happens in the Tales from the Pizzaplex short stories. Edwin Murray survives whatever happens in the Mimic, and he shows up again much later in the timeline in the Storyteller. And when the Mimic rears its head again, Edwin is there to try to stop it. And in trying to stop it, he ends up losing his own life. And yes, the books are not one-to-one with the games. Secret of the Mimic proved that. These books are at best parallels to the main story of the games. But in saying that, they do parallel, they have similar themes. So if so, is there a case to make for Help Wanted 2? Well, timeline-wise, we don't really know how old Edwin Murray is, but we know he says he's too young to take over the company sometime in the 70s. So it's the 70s, he has one kid, he has a job. we can assume like somewhere in his 20s. So if he's somewhere in his 20s in the 70s, by the time of the security breach Pizzaplex, he's like in his 70s or 80s, which is old, to be fair, but it's not debilitatingly so. He's still able to do things, at least what we see in Help Wanted 2, which isn't insanely physically enduring. It's just kind of doing a job at the Pizzaplex and maneuvering around a room. It's not like he's doing security breach where he's running and hiding and all that. So the timeline aside, is there any way to link the evidence we have from Help Wanted 2 to Edwin Murray? And the more you think about it, yeah, a lot of it, if not all of it. A lot of the context evidence immediately lines up, but that's some of the easier stuff that most people could slot into. You know, the evidence that they worked at the Pizzaplex and they wanted to stop what was ever going on with the Mimic. Most characters who would be potential candidates fit those categories. Similar to having a Vanny mask. If he's an employee, then duh. And what makes you so special has a lot of interpretations. If Cassie's dad is the Bonnie bully, what makes you so special refers to the fact that he's been here since the beginning and he was involved in the crying child's death. But if the player is Edwin Murray, then what makes you so special is fairly obvious. He's the guy who made the Mimic. That's why he's so special. But it doesn't just stop at the context evidence. The hard evidence we have lines up nearly perfectly. Let's look at Mystic Hippo. Her line is, "The key is familiar to you." Now, it's immediately notable that Mystic Hippo is a Murray's Costume Manor original character. Her poster was in the back of Big Top's showroom, which leads us to believe she was part of this Fall Fest package that was being sold to Fazbear, something that MCM created, which is already interesting to point out with possible Edwin Murray connections. But think about the line here. Use this key to confront the darkness, the key is familiar to you. But she's handing us a Faz Wrench, and the Faz Wrench is used to open plenty of doors in the gameplay, but the thing the Faz Wrench does is adjust circuitry, and for some reason that happens to open doors along the way. The Faz Wrench itself is not a key, it's a wrench. And frankly, if we already owned a Faz Wrench, familiar isn't the correct word to use here. This is something you know, this is yours, if it's something that we've seen before. But her phrasing is, the key is familiar to you. Now, you know what is a key? A data diver. The thing that the Faz Wrench was fully copied off of. The data diver from Murray's Costume Manor that literally's main use is to access terminals and access doorways. A key to access things. It's so much a key that one of the posters that was used as a teaser for Secret of the Mimic says, "Your data diver is the key." So calling a Faz Wrench a familiar key is, in a way, calling it, hey, this is kind of like the data diver. Now let's go back into the context of Help Wanted 2. Cassie's dad has no reason to have any idea what a data diver is. It's a piece of Murray's Costume Manor technology. And Cassie's dad is older, but I don't think he's old enough to have worked at Murray's Costume Manor, so it wouldn't be familiar to him. But Edwin? He was around when the data diver was invented. Frankly, there's a high chance that he was the one who invented the data diver. So if you showed him a Faz Wrench and said, "It's a familiar key to you," and he took it and went, "This kind of does look like a data diver," and went to use it like a key, that makes perfect logical sense for it to be Edwin. Not to mention the Fall Fest levels. Look, we don't really know what these mini games are, if we're accessing files, going through security footage, or even going through our own mind. After all, we're in some weird AR world. But if these mini games are based off the memory of the player, we're at a Fall Fest, and Carney looks at us and says, "You look like you have kids," which most of us, myself included, takes to go, oh, well, Cassie's dad has a kid named Cassie, so that makes sense. But think about it for a moment. Fall Fest, as far as we know, was only in the 70s and 80s, which means that whoever this is talking about would have had a kid in the 70s and or 80s. And Cassie's like 10 or something. There's no way she's 40. So even if Cassie's dad was old enough to be at Fall Fest when it came out, there's no way he would have already been old enough to have a kid, let alone have a kid in the first place. But let's go over the timeline. Who's somebody who's not only innately familiar with Fall Fest, but would have had a kid around the time that Fall Fest was running? Edwin Murray. Literally a huge plot point of Secret of the Mimic is that Fall Fest is going on while David exists, because Fiona dies at one, and she couldn't have given birth to David after she's dead. So clearly, while Fall Fest is running, Edwin Murray has a child. So the idea of Edwin having a memory of being at Fall Fest and being told, you look like you have kids, makes perfect sense. Not to mention, if these minigames are distortions of memories, which is very possible, if not likely, then how interesting is it that every Fall Fest minigame ends with a fire? Almost like Edwin has some unprocessed trauma about fires and Fall Fest, since his wife died in a fire at Fall Fest. And all of this is great, but here's the real kicker, the real clincher for this theory. Candy Cadet. His second story is something that still stumps many of us to this day. His second story about a woman who faces off against a witch, loses but escapes being horribly scarred, and then comes back later in life to try to confront the witch again, but is instead tricked by a little boy and ends up the witch's meal. The current interpretation that I like the most comes from ID's fantasy, saying that Cassie's dad was actually Jeremy from Help Wanted, and he survived the encounter with Glitchtrap then, but being scarred by the whole face slicer thing, and then comes back in Help Wanted 2 and is ultimately tricked and fails. That's good, that adds up well, but that's not the only interpretation we have here, because somebody who faces off against something in their youth, is left scarred, and then tries again later and dies, also perfectly matches up with Edwin Murray and the Mimic. Because in his youth in the 70s, Edwin Murray beat the Mimic senseless, but it tricked him and destroyed his office trying to kill him. If he survived this encounter, he would have likely been left horribly maimed. After all, in the audio log we hear him complaining heavily about his legs, which were likely crushed in the explosion. So if he never properly heals from that, that qualifies for this story. And Help Wanted 2 innately lines up with the second half of this story. Whoever the player is, in this case Edwin, goes to confront Glitchtrap again, but is instead tricked by a little boy, Helpy. Something that would be perfectly tailored for Edwin Murray to trust. After all, Helpy is heavily based off of Helpful, Mr. Helpful, his own character. So seeing the new interpretation of his own character giving him instructions, he's more likely to trust that. That's a perfect trap specifically for Edwin Murray, which would mean this story lines up perfectly with the idea of Edwin Murray surviving Secret of the Mimic and failing in Help Wanted 2. So like, yeah, oh my god, it might be Edwin Murray. Look, am I saying this is 100% correct? No, not really. Like I said, the timeline is a little iffy here, and Edwin Murray maybe didn't even survive Secret of the Mimic. And there's no great answer for the Bonnie mask in Princess Quest. The closest thing I could figure out was that M2 wears a similar one, but it's not even the same Bonnie mask, so that's not great. But there is such a massive connection and possibility here, I would be remiss if I didn't make a video about it. That's kind of the joy of theorizing, taking these kind of out there ideas and taking them to their logical conclusion to see what we find along the way. And who knows, maybe it's right. But I'd love to hear your thoughts in the comments below. Am I crazy, or was this a fun experiment? In the meantime, speaking of the future of the franchise, if you want to know my thoughts about the teasers we've been getting about the next FNAF game, you can find that video right here. For our fan art featured on the channel, make sure to share with #ToastArt. A huge thank you to the best channel members, the Dough Risers, and until next time, as always, stay toasty, slices.